Well, hello, everyone, and good morning. Today is October, I've got to look at my computer, October 13th, 2022, and welcome to the latest episode this week of We'll Work for Food, the New Possibilities Hour. As always, it's a pleasure to have you here, and we look forward to a fantastic presentation today from Bruce Edwards, who was always on my short list of mediators, along with Jeff. And back when I was in practice, and I know that we will learn a lot today, and so it'll be great to hear what he has to say. But before that, as Jeff always says, what he loves so much about this is hearing how much we've raised for food banks around the world, because as you know, there is no charge for these presentations. It's just asked that you please make a donation to either the food bank of the speakers suggestion or your own local food bank. And we've been supporting, as a group, this global legal community has been supporting food banks around the world. And at this point, the number of which we know, donations of which we know, and everybody doesn't tell us how much they've donated, but we would love it if you did. So Jeff, what's our number today?
Thank you, Jean. It is a wonderful part of the presentation each week when we announce the running total. So far, our generous audiences have contributed an amazing $318,000.45 to food banks worldwide in honor of our great speakers. And we look forward to another wonderful presentation from Bruce this morning. Jean, back to you.
Thanks, Jeff. And again, I would encourage any of you, if you're able to make a donation today, even while you're on this or at your convenience. And then if you would let one of us know, we would love to add it to our total. That's over 3 million meals, probably, give or take, depends on how they do the math. But many people have been fed thanks to the generosity of those who have spoken and attended these programs. So that said, let's get on to today's program. It's definitely my honor and privilege to introduce today Bruce Edwards. If you don't know him, you probably do know him, but if you don't know him, Bruce is a mediator in California. Well, he mediates anywhere in the world, but he's based in California in the San Francisco Bay Area, and he has been mediating since 1986. He's one of the founders and former board chair, I believe it is, of JAMS. And I know, as I said before, he was on my short list as a mediator when I was in practice. He has been doing a lot of interesting things lately, including not just mediating, but training mediators from around the world. And so, sorry, spam risk is calling me there. Forgot to move the phones out of this room, sorry. Anyway. So much for spam risk. So he has built Edwards Mediation Academy, he and his wife, and they run that and train mediators from around the world. And in fact, when I when I was moving from my practice into a full-time mediation role, I took the advanced mediation class, and it was wonderful. So I highly recommend that too. I'll give a plug for that if you're interested. Edwards Mediation Academy. So against all that backdrop, you've got a lot of interesting things, I'm sure, to share with us today. And so, Bruce, the floor is yours if you would tell us about your food bank and then just head on into your presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Jean, for all the kind words and your support over the years. Anytime I'm on a short list with Jeff, I consider myself honored and privileged. So I'm in good company. And really, the pleasure is mine today. You're all obviously in the profession, and I commend not just your professional trajectories, but the stewardship on this important issue of hunger and food insecurity. We've chosen the Glide Memorial Church and its attendant food bank because Susan and I sort of having the privilege of not having food insecurity and living in the largely white suburbs, as so many of our families are raised. We, in the early days, found it difficult to get our children to sit still in church, and yet kind of wanted to give them some real life experiences to introduce them to people that live differently than we do. And so on Sundays, we would then drive into the Tenderloin in San Francisco, which, for those of you who aren't familiar with it, is sort of the poorest of the poor type neighborhoods in the city, with lots of street people, homeless, drug use, and certainly hunger paramount amongst the issues. And the kids would stand in serving lines and assist putting food on people's trays and delivering food and cleaning up after folks that don't look like the most of us. And to this day, I think it was one of the more informative experiences that they've had in their lives. And on occasion, we were privileged to be able to even take some of their friends along for that experience. We've had some other experiences, or I have, and Susan, with food insecurity. My father, after he retired and into his 70s, began serving sandwiches from the church at a local park up in the foothills of California. And literally, homeless people came out of the woods to try and avail themselves of free sandwiches and get food. That effort mushroomed into the first homeless shelter that he was responsible for building up in El Dorado County. And to this day, in his 90s, he remains active in supporting homeless causes and food distribution efforts. And then sort of maybe the most visual memory I have, Susan and I one year were teaching in Delhi, and we took a day to take a walking tour of Old Delhi. And we went to the Sikh temple in Old Delhi, which, as many of you know, the sort of Sikh religion is premised in part on taking care of the poor and those who don't have what we all have. And we went into this food distribution center, and if you can imagine these pots of rice and beans that are 6 feet across being stirred with large wooden paddles, all in an effort to feed about 80,000 people a day in Delhi. So it just gives us all a moment to sort of step back and remind ourselves that I think the statistics are something like about 1/8 of the world population, over 1 billion people, and maybe even as many as 1 in 4 children in the United States have issues surrounding food insecurity or hunger. And while many of us have never gone to bed hungry or skipped a meal so our children could eat, it is imperative that we do think about these kinds of issues. And I today applaud you for all of your efforts to try and make that an important topic of conversation and issue. And we support all of the efforts. So thank you for letting me be a very small part of that. But you brought me here to talk a little bit about other things, so let me get to work. It's as we often say in life, and many of you have heard me say this before, the danger in life is not knowing what we don't know. And as mediators, and in the world of mediation, the corollary to that is the danger in the mediation world is not knowing what we should know. And so often in our zest and zeal to improve ourselves as mediators, we're quick to run to mediation skill development courses. And while I applaud that, I do want to slow that momentum today and try and talk about something that maybe doesn't get discussed as much. And I tried to think a little bit about what I might have to offer a very sophisticated group who undoubtedly has heard from so many others over the years, so many other aspects of training. And I asked myself, what could I provide that was unique and potentially thought-provoking, and maybe included some useful tips for people who are largely very experienced. And it dawned on me that this summer, I had the privilege for the first time since the pandemic of getting back to Europe. And as part of that journey, reconnected with a couple of friends of mine who for years I taught with in Austria every other summer as we taught mediators from different parts of the world. And my colleague, Dr. Mario Patera, is a psychotherapist and trainer of largely corporate types on mediation competency. And so we had a lot of interesting conversations in our couple days together. And as the conversation sort of drifted to current mediation training programs, and particularly what Susan and I are doing through the Edwards Mediation Academy, we sort of took a big step backwards from some of the nuts and bolts of that training to talk about what is really, to some, a blind spot in the mediation training world. And that really is, what should we all do by way of self-reflection and self-management to become the best we can be as mediators before one sets foot in the mediation room? And so we all know, I'm not telling you anything you don't, that the definition of mediation is a facilitated negotiation. And yet so often we just scurry past the word facilitated and get into the heart of what we do, which is negotiation. And yet that word facilitated, if we think about it for a moment, or we realize that it means, it really connotes the introduction of a third party into the conflict equation. And we as mediators coming into that room, obviously, bring our own set of unique life experiences, our own unique emotions, our own unique style of communication, our own biases and prejudices, and all the things that make us so unique as human beings. It's why in the company that I work with, we have over 450 mediators, and everyone is different. And yet we know collectively and individually that mediation is largely a personal service business because of the uniqueness of what we bring to the table. And it's why people select us or put us on short lists, like me and Jeff and maybe a few others. Even though we have different approaches to this, there's certain things we have in common and certain approaches we share. But it's this concept that as a third party in the room, we really do change the dynamic, we change the air in the room, and it's how we prepare ourselves to be that person in the room that's so important, it's so central to our ultimate success as mediators. So a blog that I wrote is probably due out this week, plus or minus. It's called Mediation Competency Begins With Me, and me is in quotes. And to some degree, that's a little bit counterintuitive because we often think about taking ourselves out of the equation, stepping back to a large part and really trying not to influence to some degree what is and should be the parties in conflict right to determine the course and ultimately the outcome of that dispute. And yet, it is appropriate that we spend time thinking about self-reflection and particularly thinking about self-management and what we can do to better ourselves along the path toward being a better mediator. So let's talk a little bit about those concepts. And I'm going to leave time for questions, if not comments, and just discussion at the end, because as we all know, these conversations are so much more rich when they are truly, to some degree, conversations. But let's talk about self-reflection for a moment. I would ask, how many of us, before we began our journeys in the mediation world, actually sat down and had self-reflective moments? And I'm not talking about just sort of cursory thinking about a subject. I'm talking about asking yourselves and writing down questions. Who am I? What kinds of communication skills do I want to develop? What are my personality strengths and weaknesses? What would my close friends and spouse say are some of those strengths and weaknesses? And sitting down and actually writing out the answers to those important questions. Because we all know from a neurobiological perspective that when you write things down, it's got a deeper learning value. That's why I continue at this late stage of my profession to take notes by handwriting as soon as I get the opportunity to listen to someone else in an environment like this, or even in the mediation world when I'm mediating, because I'm able to imprint information by writing it down with pencil or pen in a deeper way than I would if I just thought about it and it became sort of a passing thought. So when you're talking about self-reflection, it's a journey that really begins with energy and devotion to this notion of how do I see myself intervening in conflict going forward? Who is it that I want to become? And what is my journey of mediation competency going to look like? These are all important evaluative moments, and the more people can spend doing this before embarking on a career, the better. And this doesn't mean that those of you who are all very successful mediators have missed the boat. Here, I'll give you a bit of a spoiler alert to today's conversation. This is a journey. The journey that we're talking about today is a lifelong journey. And it's a journey that continues for me after 35 years of mediating, that I still learn from each of you, and I learn from other people I'm in contact with, and I learn things about myself as I go through these processes. So let's move a little bit from this concept of self-reflection into probably the next category of discussion, which is self-management. And what do I mean by self-management? What do mediators need to know to better understand about themselves before we can effectively engage with others in conflict? And ancient Greeks talked a bit about the human experience using sort of three variables, kind of mind, body, and spirit. And I'm going to talk about that in a moment. But before I launch into that part of today's conversation, when we talk about self-management, I do think it's important to talk about what it is not, to just distinguish for a moment what we're trying to impart. And often, you see these seminars on self-management techniques in the business world, and usually those focus on time management or becoming more efficient. And those are laudable goals, to be sure, but that's qualitatively different than what I'm talking about this morning. Here, in contrast, discussion of self-management techniques by mediators is really less about efficiency and more about effectiveness. It's really less about acquiring specific skills, and it's more about developing social competencies. So let's dive into it, and let's talk about self-management as a tool for self-improvement as mediators. Again, going back to the overlay or template that I've identified for discussion purposes this morning, thinking about self-management of the mind, thinking about self-management of the body, and thinking about self-management of the spirit, or as I will further define it, emotions, I think is a helpful way of sort of setting a framework for discussion going forward. So as with every triangle, just envision three equal sides, appropriately labeled: self-management of the mind, self-management of the body, and self-management of the spirit or emotions. And this really does become an important concept. I'm going to say it several times throughout the morning, but this is a journey. And to even think about what we're talking about today as a training, if you will, sort of does an injustice or disservice to the notion. Training sort of implies a bit more of one and done. It implies that you learn a technique and you put it in your toolkit and you're ready to move on. This is really more about who am I? How can I improve myself going forward? And how can I get better each day as a mediator? And if people think about it in those terms, it's really less about training than it is more about a lifelong journey. So this idea of self-management really is about a journey. So let's talk about self-management of the mind. Many of you know from listening to courses that I've taught in the past, or things that Susan and I have put on the Edwards Mediation Academy website, either training programs or blogs or both, that years ago I coined the term mediator's mind. And mediator's mind is really reflects a philosophical construct of how one thinks about his or her role as intervening in conflict. And it really helps set the stage for us in all things we do in mediation. I sometimes describe it as the North Star of our efforts, because when one is lost, confused, needs direction or guidance in mediation, coming back to your mediator's mind is really a healthy place to return, to get grounded, and to begin again in the moment that you're in. And so this mediator's mind, this mental model or philosophical construct, it really does shape each and every intervention we have. I mean, if you take the classic sort of examples and you think about, what's my role as a court annexed mediator? Or what is my role as a commercial mediator? What might be my role if I were a co-mediator in a community mediation context? Obviously, those are all different branches of the same tree, yet how we approach those different interventions will be reflective of how we think about our role. And over the years, I've had discussions in classes with people about, should I start by thinking about myself as a guest at someone else's dispute? Should I think about myself as a host at someone else's dispute? I certainly don't think about myself as a ringleader or puppet master at somebody else's dispute. So however we start to think about it, it starts to shape our perspective on how we're going to intervene. And so all of the practical moments, the decisions that we are asked to make as mediators minute to minute in mediation are really reflective at some points consciously, but hopefully ultimately subconsciously, by how we define ourselves and our role as mediators. So for example, if I, and we're all, yes, focused to some degree on getting cases resolved. That's why we're in the profession, getting disputes, put behind us as best we can. That's why we're in the profession. But if that becomes our sole objective, to the detriment and exclusion of other things, it's going to shape how we intervene in the mediation process. Conversely, again, using sort of the quintessential example, if we are still focused on helping the parties resolve disputes, but along the way, attentive to opportunities for improving communication, helping people understand how they got in this problem in the first place, looking for ways to help repair relationships and other sort of transformative moments in mediation, that too is going to point us in a different direction. It's going to shape our interventions. Literally every intervention we can conceive of, those that we engage in day to day, are going to be reflective of our mediator's mind. So how one designs a process. Are you going to design a court annex process where everybody has 2 hours of time to air their dispute and work with you toward resolution? And if that's the process design moment, that's going to be reflective of what you're trying to accomplish, your mediator's mind, meaning a prioritization of trying to get that matter resolved. Conversely, if you've got more less limited time and can develop a process that is open and more flexible, it will also allow you to approach that dispute differently. The kinds of questions that you ask are going to be reflective of your mental model. If I view myself as a host of someone else's dispute, you can assume that the kinds of questions that I'm going to ask will be more open-ended kinds of questions, helping draw people into the conversation, as opposed to potentially being in a more evaluative time frame mode where I've got a different mindset on what my role is on that given day. So from process design to the questions that I ask, to the amount of time that I can devote to listening to other people, to literally sort of every intervention, it really begins with the mediator's mind, this mental model. And so the more time you can take to really try and shape that model, ingrain that model, have it become a subconscious part of how you're going to approach the mediation, the stronger your interventions are going to be, and the more they're going to reflect what you hope to try and achieve, because all of those momentary decisions will then be coordinated and reflective of a broader purpose. I said one of the things I want to do today is give some practical tips on how one does this, because it's great to talk about these sorts of things, but I'm big on trying to make sure people understand how to implement. And one of the things I've done over the years to sort of implement this is, in the early days particularly, I kept a mediation journal, really a log of mediation experiences. And while I sought to capture a little bit of some of the demographics of the mediation, what kind of case it was and what kind of issues were involved, what was the outcome, the biggest section of all in that diary was what I learned from that mediation experience. What kinds of things happened that were unique, what kind of chances I took, what kind of decisions I made, not substantively, but process-wise, and what was the result of those decisions. And the more I was able to write those things down over time, the more I was able to see a common thread developing through that diary and through that exercise. Was I really staying true to this North Star that I had developed? When I wandered from that, what was the outcome in certain practical moments of mediation experience? So think about this idea of sort of management of the mind, and think about this idea of how we approach mediation and the mental model that will direct our approaches. Look, a couple other concepts related to self-management of the mind. All of you probably practice some form of mindfulness, whether it's sort of meditation, or something else. We know that, as I've said before, life is focused attention. And we know that as we work through our daily lives, we only bring a fraction of our ability to focus attention to a particular moment. And I think as mediators, the goal is to sharpen that focus, improve our ability to try and be in the moment. I love the bumper sticker that says, "I'd rather be here now," because I think it does sort of highlight the idea that we're often wandering in our thinking and in our focus. And part of self-management of the mind is really developing the ability to be in the moment with people who not only have every right to expect, but really deserve that kind of sharpened focus, whether it's listening or thinking about their issues or otherwise. And then ultimately, there's a lot we could talk about with regard to self-management of the mind. And I'm just giving you a couple different examples. How we define success as mediators is part of your mental model. And those of you who have taken courses from me in the past, or maybe from other instructors, are familiar with the satisfaction triangle and the concept that there's different ways to think about success in mediation. And just sort of by way of quickly summarizing, if you think about the satisfaction triangle as being a reflection of both process satisfaction, individual or psychological satisfaction, as well as outcome satisfaction. Visually, you can appreciate that it's not all about getting the case settled. It's equally about attending to a fair process. It's equally about tending to people's psychological and personal well-being in the process. And so from the standpoint of self-management of the mind and developing your mental model, if you can develop that broader focus of who am I, what am I trying to achieve in this process, it will take a little bit of the pressure off of the sense we all have of, is this conflict going to resolve with my intervention? And that too has benefits at a variety of different levels. Again, I'm going to remind everybody, these are all things I'm talking about today that should occur before people walk into a mediation room. That's what, to me, makes this conversation a bit unique, because let's face it, I tell people in mediation training all the time that a good portion of mediation training is unlearning what we've all learned, getting to this moment in our lives. So many of us, I'll include myself to some degree, are type A individuals. We've gotten to where we are because we're achievers. We succeed, however we define that. But as mediators, we sort of have to unlearn some of those things that have brought us that success getting to this point in time. And that means sort of slowing things down. It means thinking about things in a different way. And it means preparing ourselves differently, maybe at a stage in life where we thought we were already prepared to move forward. Let's move on and talk next about kind of self-management of the body. What do I mean by self-management of the body? Well, we start with the obvious. We all know that the majority of communication is nonverbal. The last 3 years have sort of given us lessons in that. I'll talk about that in a moment. But this idea that we somehow spend time kind of talking about learning from others based on their nonverbal cues is an important part of mediation training, to be sure. But what about holding the mirror up to ourselves? What do we know and what can we learn about who we are and how we come across to other people as we move into that environment? And certainly one of the great things, albeit painful, speaking now from personal experience only, is sitting there for 8 hours on a computer screen, looking at myself amongst others and seeing how it is I must be perceived by everybody else in the room. And not just, sort of broadly speaking, but I'm talking moment to moment. What kind of facial expressions do I evidence when somebody says something that just doesn't pass the credibility test, or I otherwise have some kind of an emotional reaction to? What do I look like, in that moment? And so, in the past, you'd almost have to sort of set up a camera in your office and run different experiments to sort of see how you're perceived. And, now we've been given this blessing of being able to do that every day and get a moment to moment immediate feedback. So becoming self-aware and awareness of your body is the first step towards self-management. And if we're doing things that are distracting, I find myself sometimes playing with my glasses. Sometimes I'm like chewing on the things, or, sometimes I'm moving around too much. I mean, whatever it is, facial expressions, all of those things we become more aware of and are able to manage better, in part because of our introduction to this technology. But beyond that, what do we do to pay attention to ourselves? And I'll give you a couple of examples. I don't know if people have heard the term somatic markers. It's a word that comes from our therapeutic science colleagues, and it really reflects those physical cues to events in our environment, usually stressors that impact us in one way or another. The classic example is, when I open my computer screen in the morning and I see, 50 emails, okay, maybe my stomach's churning just a little bit, but then I start to look down the list of who sent me those emails, and all of a sudden I hit 1 or 2, and I go from 0 to 10 on the Richter scale before I've even seen what's, in that email, and I can feel it. I can feel it in my body. For each of us, we feel it differently. Maybe it's a churning in my stomach. Maybe it's a clenching of my jaw. Maybe it's the hair raising on the back of my neck. Maybe I'd start tapping my foot unconsciously. But it's a somatic marker. It's something that is suggesting to me that I'm heading close to the flame, and for whatever reason, my body is reacting. And paying attention to that has value to us as we contemplate how we're going to respond, as we take care of ourselves. I'll talk about that in a moment. But becoming aware in the first instance of how our body responds in these certain moments is a helpful indicator of both what we're about to encounter and how we need to respond ourselves to be in a position to be most effective. So paying attention to these physical clues in our environment and how it impacts our physical selves is tremendously important. Look, I'm not going to spend a lot of time this morning talking about physical preparation. You all have had those kinds of lessons in the past, but particularly as I get older in this profession, doing this day in and day out, it's increasingly obvious to me that, training ourselves, if not like an Olympic athlete, but certainly as at least more than a weekend warrior, is an important way of trying to deliver our best physical selves in the moment. Whether that's nutrition, exercise, sleep, meditation, a host of other things, but paying attention to ourselves physically, I think, and to meet the demands of mediation is really an important conversation. So sitting down, again, not just asking yourself, what am I doing to prepare physically, but writing down answers and staying with a program, I think, is a practical way of trying to ensure that you're going to deliver the best physical self to this otherwise emotionally charged environment. And I guess lastly, as I'm talking about self-management of the body, more and more in our profession, people like Jeff and me and many of you who have been doing this now for decades, this idea of self-compassion and self-care is an increasingly important topic of conversation. What we do to try and take care of ourselves, I mean, it's obviously counterintuitive to many of us that those who have chosen a career devoted to helping other people often ignore our own self-needs. And so this idea of thinking about what one can do to bring the same kind of compassion to the conversation for yourselves that you're bringing to the room for other people is an important thing. Not just, for longevity and personal health, but it does, I think, help put you in a better position emotionally, mentally, to be able to be that third person in the room if you've taken care of yourself, if you exercise self-compassion. And indeed, there's moments in mediation, again, I'm trying to keep this discussion about pre-mediation efforts, but we all know that there are moments in mediation where one has to exercise self-compassion. One has to raise a white flag of timeout and take a walk for your benefit, if not others. Those kinds of things are under the umbrella of self-compassion. But I'm talking about, again, preparation. I'm talking about self-management. I'm talking about those things that take place before the mediation. And if you can help begin to train yourself to be compassionate about yourself, you're going to bring that into the room, and it's going to reflect with others around you. And this idea of self-care has not only benefits in the room when you enter, but it obviously has benefits to the longevity of your career as well. So self-management of the body is a very important conversation because it does impact the mediation skill development, and it impacts who you bring into the room physically to try and assist others. So think about that second side of the triangle, self-management of the body. Now we get to one of my favorite topics in mediation, which is self-management of the spirit or emotions. And look, again, I'm not going to talk down to everybody who are scarred veterans of lots of training programs, I'm sure, talking about the value of emotions in mediation. And it's certainly been my privilege over the years to try and help people talk about emotions in mediation. I'm reminded of this course I taught one year for 40 hours in Rwanda, scene of one of the most horrific events in world history, this genocide, where over 1 million people were killed in 100 days. And in the course of that training program and beginning the discussion on emotions, one of the participants, mediators in training, raised his hand and said, "We don't need to talk about this, Bruce. We don't have emotions." And it was a great segue into a very deep dive into a discussion with people who have much to teach the world about emotions, I assure you. But my point in that is so much of our conversation over the years is sort of outward facing. What is the role of emotions in mediation? How did we move from a society hundreds of years ago where emotions were largely ignored to a moment in time where, if people are being intellectually honest, if people are basing their comments on scientific information, we now know that there is no cognitive thought without an emotion attached. And therefore, the conversation must begin with what is the role of emotions in conflict. But that's a conversation for a different day to a degree. What I'd like to focus on this morning is more, what does that mean for us as mediators in terms of self-management? What does that mean for us in terms of preparing our own spiritual or emotional selves to be the best we can in a high conflict environment? And again, sort of with apologies to some degree for those of you who have taken courses with me or otherwise online, we begin with sort of self-reflective kinds of exercises. The concept of is you can't know in life where you're headed until you know from where you come. And so the first step in any of these journeys is to try and get a platform of where you are. And there are lots of ways to do that. One of the exercises that we use is what we call the family of origin technique, where we ask people to draw a diagram with yourself as the hub of the wheel, and the spokes reach out to those family members. And this reflects your earliest memories in life. So think back to when you were probably 4 or 5 or 6, and who was in your house of origin, who was in your circle of family. And then those spokes really become opportunities to think about how conflict and emotions were displayed in that environment. And sometimes we'll even ask people to scale the emotions on those spokes on a scale of 1 to 10. 10, of course, being the highest display of emotions, and 1, of course, being emotions were really subjugated and not discussed at all. And think about it, focus on it. Obviously, if there's somebody in the family you want to talk about it with, all the better, to make sure that your memories and reflections are truly yours, but also reflective of the environment. And maybe you'll learn something along the way about yourself. That's the hope. And then the goal, as with any journey, of course, is how do you get from there to where you want to be? So then you go and you start thinking, well, who do I want to be as it relates to emotions? And how can I build what I euphemistically describe as a stronger emotional muscle. Of course, we know it's not a muscle, but it just helps people think about the strength to be gained from exercising. And in building that emotional muscle, the best way, of course, to do it is to try and get yourself into environments where there are emotions around you, and to get increasingly more comfortable in managing those emotional moments. An example I give in some of the courses we teach is, there was one day I was mediating at the company in a large conference room, and I could hear voices through the wall behind me in a separate mediation, and they grew increasingly loud, and I sort of ignored it, as I would do, and continued with my own mediation. And over the course of the next several minutes, it got to a point where it was so loud, I really just couldn't completely ignore it. And I stuck my head out the doorway into the hallway and looked down toward this room. And when I did that, I realized there were a few other mediators who had had a similar reaction as I did, wondering, what was going on behind the door. And all of a sudden the door opens, and out of the room walks one of our distinguished judges, Ed Pinelli, an Italian-American. That's only important because he turned and saw everybody looking down the hall at him, and he realized that maybe it had been somewhat loud in his room. And he looked at all of us. He said, "What? You guys haven't heard a couple Italian brothers airing their differences before?" And it was really suggestive of a moment where he obviously was very comfortable in an environment of high emotions. Whether that was something that he grew up with or that was something he had to train himself to do, we're all different. And I know in my instance, I've had to train myself over the years to be comfortable in those moments of high emotion, to the point where now, if you were a fly on the wall and you observe things develop in an emotional way, you might even see a situation in a joint session where lawyers are looking at me, and you all have probably experienced this as well, where the lawyers look at you with this eye of, aren't you going to stop this? Aren't you going to tamper this down in some fashion? And the answer is no, not quickly, not as long as I think it's making progress at some level, not if I think it's satisfying people's emotional needs. And so training myself to be that person in that moment does not come naturally, does not come easily. This idea of self-managing our own emotions, I don't mean squelching our emotions, I mean getting comfortable with them, is a key to our success in mediation. Look, even the words we use shape our understanding of this environment. I'm going to blank, I always do, on this 19th century German philosopher who said, the limits of my words are the limits of my world. The limits of my words are the limits of my world. And the idea there is the obvious, which is how we define things verbally impact our thinking. And so we've done an exercise in mediation training where we sit and we write down all the words that we can think of favorably attached to different kinds of emotions, because emotions are often thought of in the negative. They're often described as needing to be managed or controlled. We use words like disruptive emotions, and we think about it in those terms because the words we use really shape our thinking. And so I encourage people, as we think about how to self-manage, sit down and write words around emotions like welcoming emotions, embracing emotions, authentic emotions. Use different words that help shape your thinking in a positive direction about the influence of emotions in mediation. And in that way, I submit you'll probably have a better reaction when emotions do in fact occur. It's a very deeper, much deeper conversation than what I've imparting, but I think it gives you an idea. I do want to give you another example of a practice tip on sort of how one can use this knowledge in a productive way. And I think most of you, I shouldn't generalize because I don't know a lot of you, but if you're like me, I'll say it that way, or Jeff, we are in this environment where it's triage. Disputes come to us, when the conflicts have ripened largely, sometimes ripened dramatically. And unfortunately, we don't often have the opportunity to be in a preventative mode. If they say, as they say, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure, we're the pound of cure. And we don't often get the chance to be the ounce of prevention. But one year I had that opportunity as a trainer, again, with my friend, Dr. Patera, and his wife, Ulrike Gam. And the three of us taught at Stanford University Hospital several different programs, not for lawyers, not for risk managers, not for HR, but the idea was to train their physicians and their nurses and all the members of the C-suite staff, including the CEO of the Stanford University Hospital chain and his chief financial officer and all the rest of the folks in the suite. And the goal was to teach them mediation competency skills so that in their work environment, they could prevent, but if not prevent, manage more appropriately conflict as it arose. And as it relates to sort of managing the spirit or managing emotions, we gave them a technique. And the technique was a scaling technique, which they then decided to implement at nursing stations when the nursing staff arrived in the morning, where they could sort of communicate clearly with each other, gauge each other's sense of emotion and mental well-being as they began to work their day together. And so what do I mean by that? The concept is you think about two separate and independent scales. One registers positive feelings, one registers negative feelings. And they're both 100-point scales, so they allow for very precise reporting. And so, for example, if you said to me, all right, Bruce, it's Thursday morning and you're about to start your day, where are you on the positive feeling, negative feeling scale? Well, I'd probably say, gee, I'm at a 90 on the positive scale because I get this great opportunity to talk with all these wonderful colleagues who are doing these great things for other people, and what could be a better way to start your day. On the negative scale, you know, maybe I'm at a 60. I'm a bit apprehensive. I've got three of us are mediating a case with probably 50 people in the office for the next 2 days. And, you know, even with my experience, there's a little bit of unwieldiness to that. And I'm a little apprehensive about it. It's been through mediation 3 times before with other people. And here we are, you know, one last stand, if you will. So, you know, I'm reporting to everybody in that conversation, my positive feelings and my negative feelings as I embark on the day. And as a self-management tool, the head of nursing staff at Stanford University Hospital said, what better way for all of our nurses when they arrive to meet privately, go around the circle, report with each other, and then all of a sudden, if somebody's a little bit grumpy, let's say, maybe it's because they had a sick child, or maybe because their kids were fighting over breakfast, they got everybody to school late. And so what might otherwise be perceived as frustration or hostility in the work environment has nothing to do with coworkers. It really just has to do with this person's experience heading into the office. And that simple exercise of sort of self-reflection, self-reporting allows them to be more productive as they engage in the work of their day. Sort of so beneficial was this training on mediation competency and self-management that the CEO came up to us after the course. He said, you know, everybody knows we've got a crash cart in the hospital for dealing with cardiac emergencies. We really need a crash cart to deal with these kinds of conflict environments using these kinds of competency techniques and bringing experienced people into the room to be able to help manage these kinds of conflicts. So my point in all of this is simply to say, we have spent a lot of time over the years thinking about emotions in mediation. But I suspect the vast majority of that thinking is about how those mediations manifest, how those emotions manifest in others, without, again, holding that mirror up to ourselves and saying, but what about me? How am I influencing that display of emotions? And what is my competency with emotions that dictates, in many instances, how that moment will play out? Because I think we all have shared experiences. Mine is that some of the most insightful moments in mediation, some of those epiphanies that really change the air, occur when there are high emotions attached. When people are speaking from the heart, sometimes at volumes that border on the shouting, I learn more about what gave rise to a conflict than I do from all of the various mediation briefs that have been submitted in advance. And so being able to welcome and embrace that moment began long before I walked into that room. It began with my ability to manage myself in that environment. So I'll give you kind of one last self-management topic of conversation, and believe me, there are many. This we've all, fortunately, in the last 5 years particularly, started to develop a conversation around bias and how we think about the world around us. And it's an ever-evolving field, one that is, I think, benefiting from neuroscience and discoveries. And the more we sort of think and talk about it, the better, as far as I'm concerned. And we know, as we prepare ourselves as mediators, there's two kinds of bias. We talk about overt or explicit bias, and those are the kinds of things that develop at a very young age. Scientific research has shown sometimes children as young as 9 months old start to develop an affinity for people that look like them as opposed to people who don't. So we know there's neurobiological components to this topic of explicit bias. The concept there, of course, is how do you self-manage in a world where you are only human, and you, all of us, each of us, have brought into the room certain explicit biases. The more pernicious, the more challenging topic in the world of bias conversation has to do with implicit bias, of course. And that refers to the mental process that we all go through, where we are at a neurobiological level that's beneath our conscious understanding, process thousands of data points a minute to try and assess our environment and make decisions, more often than not without our conscious awareness. And how that impacts us as we move through and navigate with others a conflict environment is an important thing to be thinking about, because it's almost incongruous to think, how do we self-manage in an environment where things happen below our conscious level? And so here too, I want to kind of try and give an example. Before I do, I will commend you. Just last week, I received a draft abstract of an article that's going to be published this fall in the Harvard Negotiation Law Review. It's written by David Hoffman out of Boston and Helen Winter, who are part of the Harvard program. And the topic is Follow the Science, Proven Strategies for Reducing Unconscious Bias. So I'm not going to attempt to summarize 90-page abstract, but I will say this conversation of implicit bias and how we attempt to self-manage our biases, be they explicit or implicit, is an important part of our preparation and developing mediation competency skills. A short answer to that, again, because I want to keep this conversation focused on some practical reality, is I think we confront and attempt to overcome implicit bias by remaining curious. Implicit bias, after all, is a process that involves us making snap judgments based on less than complete information, and certainly at a subconscious level more often than not. So things we can do both to begin by increasing our awareness of this process, knowing in the first instance that that's part of how our brain works. There's no fault attached to it, nor should there be. It's really a question of a process, and how do we interrupt that process in a way that's productive and meaningful for us developing our mediation competency skills. And as I've told people, the answer to that is maintaining your curiosity. They, in this article, actually have a fancy Harvard word for it called individuation. But for me, it's just about developing data points by asking questions so we can best understand and appreciate who that actual person is that's in front of us. Not who we think they are, not subconsciously who they remind us of, not based on some information that's playing out at a subconscious level. But the more we can bring that person to life by finding out who they are and the nuances of their background, it serves us well, not just as we attempt to connect with people, knowing that that's a goal of our early mediation efforts, but also as a way of overcoming this process of implicit bias. I'll give you an example. It's painful, but I use it. About 10 years ago, my younger sister passed away based on an obesity-related disease. And so I have always had to come to terms with my own biases, be they explicit or potentially implicit, in dealing with people in a weight gain kind of environment. Visually, I see someone who looks heavy, and I have to sort of think about it and remind myself and make sure I'm not treating them any differently than I'm treating others around me. And in this article, this abstract, there's a technique developed by my dear friend, Nina Meyerding, and I've taught with Nina for over a decade at Pepperdine. And if you ever have the opportunity to invite Nina to this conversation. She's one of God's gifts to the mediation world. So do put her on a short list, speaking of short lists. But back to Nina. Nina has this mnemonic device, which she uses in this same environment of dealing with weight gain issues. And the mnemonic device is called image. And so she thinks about the word image. And image is a mnemonic device. The I stands for illness. Maybe this person we're looking at has a hypothyroid problem. The M stands for medication. Maybe this person's taking a medicine that is causing them to experience weight gain temporarily. The A stands for access to healthy food. We know that there are food deserts for many demographics of people out there, and maybe these people don't have the same economic opportunity or availability of healthy food. This idea of the G stands for genetics. Each of us obviously shaped in large part by our heredity. And E, the environment we live in, be it social, physical, or otherwise, plays a role in how we look physically. So this is just one example of a potential type of bias and one technique for self-management of that type of bias. So look, there's a lot we can talk about under the heading of self-management. I hope you're taking away from today's conversation. Essentially, everything we've discussed is part of our learning journey, and part of our learning journey that begins long before we enter the mediation room, which hopefully makes this conversation a bit unique. I'll close by saying years ago, I was listening to a 60 Minutes episode, and the interviewer was interviewing Misty Copeland being the first African-American ballet dancer to dance for one of the 3 premier ballet companies in New York. And in the interview, the interviewer observed, he said, Misty, or Miss Copeland, he said, "What you do looks so effortless." And she paused right there and she said, "Sir, I need you to know that I have spent a lifetime of effort making this look effortless." And that really brings me back to the key point of today's conversation, which is it really does take a lifetime of effort, of conscious thinking and attention, of self-reflection, and ultimately self-management along this journey toward mediation competency. So thank you for the good attention today. Thank you again so much for the opportunity just to share some of these thoughts with you. And obviously, if there's a couple questions in the minutes we have remaining, I'd be delighted to take an attempt at answering them. But Jean, back to you. Thank you, thank you, thank you.
Oh, thank you so much, Bruce. I've got a whole page of notes here. So really meaningful, very much appreciated. Does anybody want to ask a question? We can go ahead and you can put up your hand. Otherwise, Jeff, I'm sure you might have something. No.
Well,
Nick, go ahead.
yes, thanks, Jean. And Bruce, thank you. That was just a terrific presentation. I think a lot about this question of preparing ourselves to be our best selves in the mediation. And there are some things that everybody can do that are just so simple, but we need to be reminded of them. One, get a good night's sleep before the mediation. Go to bed on time. Don't stay up watching TV or surfing the internet too late. Eat a good breakfast. A lot of us eat carbohydrate-rich breakfasts, and they're not healthy for us. There's a great recording of Dr. Jordan Peterson and how he treats clinical patients. And when they come in with severe anxiety symptoms, first question he'll often ask them is, "Are you hungry?" And they'll say, "Yes, I'm hungry." And he'll say, "Have you eaten anything with protein in it?" "No." "Have you eaten anything with healthy fats in it?" And the answer is no. So eating a breakfast, I often carry an avocado or 2 with me into a mediation. Hydration. Drink a 16-ounce glass of water first thing when you wake up. And get a little, and keep water. Here I'm sitting in the spare bedroom at my house. We have a western exposure. The afternoon, it gets pretty, the sun beats down. And I find I consciously have to stay hydrated. And I also find dressing up helps. I notice you're wearing a tie, Bruce. I'm wearing a tie. I still always wear a tie when mediating. And I think that that level of formality and decorum that we bring to the circumstances, even in a case where other people, if it's a entertainment industry or technology case where perhaps other people are dressed more casually, I think those all are things that all help me bring my best self to the mediation. And it helps with emotional control, it helps with focus, it helps with all these things.
You know, you talk about that, Jeff. Every morning when I would go to the office, when I was in practice for, more than 3 decades, I would wear perfume and the makeup and et cetera, et cetera. I still put on my perfume before I start a mediation on Zoom. And, they don't know it, but I know it. I feel like I'm dressed and ready for my day and in a professional way.
The other point about bias, Bruce, is that where does the mediator's bias creep in? And in my own mind, the mediator's biases creep in the shuttle diplomacy. When we are the merchants of hearsay and we're repeating and paraphrasing, we're deciding in essence what to say, what not to say, what to emphasize, what not to emphasize, what sequence to use when we present ideas. And I think one easy tool to prevent or combat our implicit biases is to let people speak for themselves more, whether through well-managed, structured, organized joint sessions, I call them summit meetings with the attorneys as the day goes on, so that I'm eliminating the opportunity for my biases to infiltrate the communication when I allow people and encourage people to speak for themselves more. I see we're about out of time. You've spoken for yourself beautifully today, Bruce, and thank you so much. Jean, you want to wrap it up?
Yes, well, thank you again, Bruce. It's just a pleasure to have you here and to hear what you have to say. So I can't thank you enough. All the best to you with this mediation you talked about you've got later on today. And thank you, Susan, Bruce's wife here, Susan Edwards, for getting this set up and for all that you both do for the legal community at large, and then for the those suffering from food insecurity, those experiencing, I should say, in food insecurity. So thank you all. If you can donate any amount, that would be fantastic. And then let one of us know. We look forward to seeing you all again next week for another fabulous presentation. So that's it for today. Thank you.
Everyone.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.